What kind of discussion did you have? Well, as far as the reinstatement of the ambassadors are concerned,
we've reached an agreement that this issue will be resolved. They will be returning to service, their permanent service, but when specifically it'll be tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, that's a mere technical issue. We've reached an agreement that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia and the U.S. State Department would begin consultations on the full range of interaction on the diplomatic track. There are many things that remain to be resolved, but both sides, including the Americans, are geared toward finding a solution. Turning now to Ukraine, yes, this issue was discussed. I can't say it was discussed in detail, but as far as I've understood President Biden, he agrees that the basis for a settlement in Ukraine, the basis needs to be the Minsk agreements. As for the entry by Ukraine into NATO, this issue was broached. That remains to be discussed. That is what that's the general line. Question from Itar Tas. Mr. Putin, you said that one of the topics was strategic stability. Could you give us some more details about decisions, the decisions on this matter that Russia and the U.S. will be resuming, or will there be talks on strategic stability and disarmament, specifically regarding the START III treaty? Have you planned to start talks on its extension? Maybe there are some parameters or there are some new agreements to be signed? The United States and the Russian Federation have particular responsibility when it comes to strategic stability in the world. This is because we are the two largest nuclear powers, and we have the largest stockpiles of warheads and delivery systems based on the levels and based on the quality of modern nuclear weapons. We acknowledge this responsibility. I think it's clear for everyone the fact that President Biden has taken on responsibility and has taken the decision, which we believe is quite timely, to extend the START treaty for 5 years up until 2024. Of course, no doubt, the question remains on what happens next. We've reached an agreement that consultations will be commenced at the interagency level under the aegis of the State Department of the United States and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia. Our colleagues at the working level will set out the composition of the delegations and the place where they'll be working and how frequently such meetings will take place. Please, let's give the floor to a foreign journalist, CNN.
Hi, Matthew Chance from CNN. Thank you very much for giving me this question. First of all, could you characterize the dynamic between yourself and President Biden? Was it hostile or was it friendly? And secondly, throughout these conversations, did you commit to ceasing carrying out cyber attacks on the United States? Did you commit to stopping threatening Ukraine's security? And did you commit to stop cracking down on the opposition in Russia?
As for the first general appraisal, I think there was no hostility, quite the contrary. Our meeting took place, principally speaking, many of our positions, we don't share the same positions in many areas, but I think that both of these sides showed a willingness to understand one another and to find ways to bring our positions closer together. The talks were quite constructive. As for cybersecurity, we reached an agreement, chiefly that we will start negotiations on that. I think that's extremely important. Now, as for who needs to take on any sort of commitment, I'd like to inform you of something. I'm talking about something that's already well known, but not known to the broader public. Not from American sources. I'm afraid that I'll confuse the names of organizations, but as for American sources, they've said that most of the cyber attacks in the world are carried out from the cyber realm of the United States. In second place is Canada. Afterwards, Latin American countries, and then comes Great Britain. Russia on this list. Where's Russia on this list? Well, we are a country whose cyber territory has the most. Russia's not on the list. Number one. Secondly, we've received from the United States 10 requests regarding cyber attacks on attacks in the United States. As our colleagues have told us, they are from the cyber realm of Russia. And there were 2 requests this year. Both last year and this year, our colleagues have received exhaustive responses. For our part, Russia last year sent in accordance, sent to the state structures of the U.S. over 40 and 35 this year, and we still haven't even received a single response on that front. This says that we do have something to work on. And the question of who, to what degree, needs to take on responsibility, that should be resolved during the negotiation process. We're going to start consultations. What we think is that when it comes to cybersecurity, cybersecurity is incredibly important in the world in general, and specifically for the United Nations, and it's also important for Russia to the same extent. I'll give you an example. We know that there were cyber attacks on a pipeline company in the United States. We also know that the company was compelled to pay $5 million to the blackmailers. Some of the money, I believe, has already been returned, according to my sources, which was paid electronically, but some of it has not been returned. And what do the state organs of Russia have to do with that? We are encountering the same threats. For example, when it comes to the healthcare system of one of the big regions of the Russian Federation. And we see that this work is being coordinated from the cyber realm of the United States. I don't think that the United States, that the official authorities have any interest in such types of manipulations. But I think just throwing out these insinuations at the expert level, that's inappropriate. We should sit and start working. That's in the interest of the United States and the Russian Federation. In principle, we've reached agreement about that, and Russia is prepared to do it. Let's continue. RT. RT, give the microphone to RT, please. Please give the microphone to. Was some of the question not answered?
So there were 2 other parts of the question. The first one is, did you commit in these meetings to stop threatening Ukraine? Remember, the reason this summit was called in the first place, or the timing of it, was when Russia was building up lots of forces across the border from Ukraine. And the second part of the question, the third part of the question, was, did you commit to stopping your crackdown against the opposition groups inside Russia led by Alexei Navalny?
So, I didn't hear that part of the question. Maybe it wasn't interpreted, or maybe you just decided to ask a second question. Let's turn now to commitments under the Ukraine. We only have one commitment, promoting the implementation of the Minsk agreements. If the Russian side is prepared to do it, then we will take that path without any doubt. Incidentally, I'd like to point out one point. Back in November of last year, what happened? The Ukrainian delegation submitted their considerations about how they are planning to implement the Minsk Accords. Please take a look. It's not a secret document. Here's what it says. Primarily, there's a need to have proposals for the political integration of Donbass into the Ukrainian legal system and constitution. To do that, there'll be a need for a constitutional amendment, as that's what it says, number one. And number two, the border between the Russian Federation and Ukraine along the line of Donbass will be occupied by the border forces of Ukraine on the day after the election. What did Ukraine propose as a first step? Returning the armed forces of Ukraine to their place of constant deployment. What does that mean? That means that the Ukrainian forces should go to Donbass. That's number one. The second thing that they proposed was closing the border between Russia and Ukraine in this area. And third, elections should be held in 3 months. In 3 months after these two steps are taken. You don't need to be an attorney. You don't need to have any special education to understand that that has nothing to do with the Minsk agreements. This runs fully counter to the Minsk agreements. That's why what additional commitments could Russia shoulder in this context? I think everything is understandable. Turning now to the exercises. We are conducting exercises on our own territory, just like the United States carries out exercises, a lot of exercises on their territory, but we didn't carry any exercises bringing our personnel and our equipment to the United States. Regrettably, the United States government is doing that right now. That's why the concerns should be not with Russia, but with the United States. But we talked about that during our talks. We clarified our positions. Turning now to the opposition and the citizen that you mentioned. Number one, this person knew that he was breaching the laws effective in Russia. He should have noted that as a person who was convicted 2 times. I'd like to underscore that he deliberately ignored the requirements of the laws. This person went abroad for treatment, and he didn't register with the authorities, and he came out of the hospital, and then he recorded a video, posting it in the internet. And then that requirement arrived. He didn't appear. He ignored the law, and he knew that he was then being investigated, and he came back deliberately. He did what he wanted to do. That's why. What can you say? As for people like him in the systemic opposition, regrettably, the format of the press conference does not allow for us to get into this in depth, but here's what I have to say. Look, I think I'm not going to say anything complicated. It's going to be clearly understandable. If you can convey this objectively to your viewers, your audience, then I'll be very grateful to you. The United States has announced that Russia is its enemy, its adversary. The Congress did that in 2017. U.S. legislation has a provision. That provision says that the U.S. needs to support the rules and the order of democratic administration in our country, and needs to support political organizations. That is enshrined in American law, the U.S. law. Now let's ask a question. If Russia is an enemy, then what organizations will support America in Russia? I don't think the ones that are strengthening the Russian Federation will do that. I think it's going to be those who are restraining it. And that is the objective of the United States, publicly stated objective. Organizing people who are promoting the implementation of Russian policy, or of American policy toward Russia, rather. And how should we feel about that? I think it's clear that we should be cautious about it. But we are going to act exclusively within the confines of Russian law. Let's give Mr. Rubin, we'll give Mr. Zarubin the microphone, then we'll continue with RT. We have heard that the American side has constantly had some rhetoric about political prisoners in Russia, the issue of Navalny. Was that discussed in your discussions with Navalny, and how was it with Biden, and if it was discussed, and how was it discussed? Also, we've all seen that there's a new stage in Russia, American relations with President Biden, and all of this started off with a very crude remark by Biden about you. What do you think? President Biden spoke about human rights. He talked about people dealing with that in the Russian Federation. We talked about that upon his initiative. That's number one. And then as for the improper statements, well, we all know about those statements. After that, President Biden called me, and we cleared things up, and his explanation was good enough for me. And he proposed that we meet in Geneva. That was his initiative. We met. I'd like to repeat that the talks were very constructive. Personally, I was convinced that President Biden is an experienced person, and it's clear that we spoke face-to-face for almost 2 hours. It doesn't happen with all leaders that you have such a detailed conversation face-to-face. As for various accusations, his predecessor was asked the same question. He didn't answer. And this president was asked the same question, and his answer was different than the answer given by President Trump. You know what? In principle, everything that's happening in our countries, in one way or another, is something that the political leadership takes responsibility for, and the people that are, number one, people in charge. As far as who's in charge, who's a murderer, in American cities, every day people are killed. That includes the leaders of various organizations. And you can't say a word about it. You don't have time to say a word and somebody's killed. You know, I remember that somebody ran away and was shot in the back, for example. But fine, those are criminal matters. But what about Afghanistan? Over 100 people were killed at one time. Well, let's say it was a mistake, but that happens too. From drones or helicopters, you know, clearly civilians were killed in Iraq. What is that? And who takes the responsibility for that? Who's the killer? Or for human rights? Listen, well, Guantanamo is still operating now. It's not in accordance with anything, not international law, not American law, not anything, but it still exists. Prisons that were open in various countries, including in European countries, for where torture was applied. What is that? Is that human rights? I don't think so. There's hardly anybody sitting in this hall today that would agree that that is protecting human rights. That's already a practice. That's real policy. And based on these practices, we understand that this is done and has continued to be done. It's being done by people who are getting money from abroad. There's some people getting money from abroad in order to further the interests of the people who are paying them. Let's continue. RT, please. One question about the Arctic. You said you talked about that. For a long time, the U.S. has accused Russia of militarizing the Arctic. We heard from Secretary of State Blinken about that in May, about concerns of the Russian military. What did you talk about? We actively discussed that in depth, in pretty big detail. That's a very important and interesting question. As for the Arctic all by itself, in the Northern Passage specifically, is extremely interesting for a number of countries, economically speaking. As for the concerns of the militarization of Americans about the militarization of the Arctic, they are completely unfounded. We're not doing anything that wasn't happening during the Soviet Union. We are establishing an infrastructure that was destroyed. Yes, we're doing that at the modern level. It includes military and border infrastructure, and also conservation infrastructure. We are creating bases for our disaster relief services in order to save people in the sea, if it comes to that, God forbid, and also to protect the environment. What I told our colleagues was that I don't see any concerns. Quite the contrary. I'm firmly convinced that we can cooperate, and we should cooperate in this area. Russia and the United States are one of the 8 members of the Arctic Council. Russia is chairing that, the Arctic Council this year. Moreover, between Alaska and Chukhotsk, there is a strait. It's a well-known strait. On the one end is Russia, and the other end is the United States. All of this should spur us to join our efforts. The situation regarding the use of the Northern Passage is governed by international law, by 2 basic laws: the Convention on the Law of the Sea of 1982, I believe it is, and the Polar Code of Conduct, which consists of a number of documents which were ratified in 2017. I pointed out something to our partners, namely we, Russia, we intend to fully adhere to these international legal standards. We're not violating anything. We're prepared to assist all stakeholders and all companies in exploring the Northern Passage. Due to climate change, this situation is changing. And we also have new ice-breaking ships. They're the most powerful in the world in Russia. That's why we definitely need to work in this area. The Convention on the Law of the Sea, I'll recall, was drawn up because it describes the legal regime, specifically in internal seas, in territorial seas, in seas that belong to a country, exclusive economic areas, and the free open seas. Internal seas, those are the seas that are within the territory of a country. Then you have the territorial waters, 12 sea miles. And then you have other categories. In the territorial seas, the military ships can go. As far as the internal seas, there's a particular regime, and we're not imposing anything on anybody there. In internal seas, just so you know, I believe there are 5. The Omsk Sea, the Aniseisk Gulf, etc. There are 5 total, 5 gulfs or bays, maybe they're called. There are almost 1,000 nautical miles. This is our sovereign right to either let ships go through there or not, but we're not abusing this rule. We're providing to anyone we're providing it to anybody who wants. There were around 1,000 applications last year, I think. And some of the ships are under Russian flags. And our regulatory authorities monitor compliance with the Polar Code of Conduct, which has requirements for ships. If all of us together, all stakeholder countries, including the member of the Arctic Council, if all of us are interested in tackling these issues, there are some areas where we need to continue to work. I'm convinced that we can find an answer. I don't see any problems that we cannot tackle. All right, in TV, please. Good afternoon, Mr. Putin. Good relations, or at least not poor relations, between Russia and America were always the guarantor of calm international relations. And you talked with Biden. Biden agreed on some matters. Now you're talking about respect. You said that your talks were characterized by that. Before the talks, you talked about red lines. And Americans have some red lines. During the talks, were you able to reach an agreement about not crossing the red lines in all areas? Is that something that would improve the relations or at least stabilize the relations? Well, I can say that on the whole, we understand what our American partners are saying. They understood what we were saying. I mean, when we're talking about red lines. But I have to be frank. Of course, we didn't get to the point where we were talking in depth about where the line would be drawn. We talked about work on cybersecurity. We talked about strategic stability. I think that during these consultations, incidentally, also all of this should be discussed, and I hope that we can agree upon it. I'm including the Arctic matters in that too. ABC News, our American branch.
Mr. President, thank you so much for taking my question. President Biden has said that he would respond if cyber attacks from Russia do not stop. I'm curious, what did he tell you? Did he make any threats? And a quick follow-up, if I may, sir. The list of your political opponents who are dead, imprisoned, or jailed is long. Alexei Navalny's organization calls for free and fair elections, an end to corruption. But Russia has outlawed that organization, calling it extremist. And you have now prevented anyone who supports him to run for office. So my question is, Mr. President, what are you so afraid of?
Okay. Once more, let me reiterate what was already said about various so-called foreign agents and about people who are positioning themselves as the non-systemic opposition. I already answered your colleague from CNN, right? But this is the law of the genre, so I have to answer your question, please. I'll do it again. The United States has adopted a law in accordance with which the U.S. has said that they will support various political organizations in Russia. At the same time, they made an announcement that the Russian Federation is an enemy. They've spoken publicly, saying that they will restrain the development of Russia. Here's a question. What organizations, what political organizations of the United States and other members of the Western community, which organizations should be supported in Russia, especially if they're paying for them? We're just like the Americans back, the way the Americans did back in the 1930s. We're calling them foreign agents. But it's not prohibited, they're not prohibited from working. They can continue to operate. Foreign agents don't need to stop operating. If they are extremist in nature, then that's another issue. The organization that you mentioned has publicly called for a mass disorder. They have publicly called for breaking the law. They called for minors to participate in activities that were against the law. And they were talking about using Molotov cocktails against the authorities as well, including against police. America just recently had very severe events after well-known events after a killing of an African American. And an entire movement developed known as Black Lives Matter. I'm not going to comment on that, but here's what I do want to say. What we saw was disorder, destruction, violations of the law, etc. We feel sympathy for the United States of America, but we don't want that to happen on our territory. And we're doing our utmost in order to not allow it to happen. And some fears, it has nothing to do with anything. Please. Could you give me the microphone, please?
You didn't answer my question, sir. If all of your political opponents are dead, in prison, poisoned, doesn't that send a message that you do not want a fair political fight?
As for who is killing whom or throwing whom in jail, people came to the U.S. Congress with political demands. 400 people. Over 400 people had criminal charges placed on them. They faced prison sentences of up to 20, maybe even 25 years. They're being called domestic terrorists. They're being accused of a number of other crimes. 70 of them were arrested right away after the events, and 30 of them are still under arrest. It's unclear on what grounds. And as for nobody from the official authorities has informed us about it. Some people died, and one of the people that died, they were simply shot on the spot by the police, although they were not threatening the police with any weapons. In many countries, the same thing happens in our country. I'd like to stress once more that we sympathize with what happened in the United States, but we have no desire to allow the same thing to happen in our country. Just a couple of more questions, because later the President will continue his program. Please hand over the microphone. I'm from Izvestia. Were you able to reach an agreement on returning some of the Russians that ended up in American prisons? If yes, then when will it happen? We talked about it. President Biden raised that question. The question about American citizens that were in Russian prisons. We discussed that. There could be some compromise that we enter into between the Russian Foreign Ministry and the U.S. State Department. They will be working on it. The Russia channel. Russia 1. You said that you discussed trade with Mr. Biden. That's probably the most positive agenda. Business from both ends are interested in development. What are the prospects that you see here? Thank you. This doesn't depend on us. It depends on the Americans. We haven't leveled any restrictions. What I think is after some restrictions were introduced in the economy and in commerce, I think that was done much more by the U.S. than by Russia. Yes, this did affect some of our development. The U.S. is carrying out their task of restraining Russia, but they didn't have any critical effect. That's number one. Number two, this has to do with the interests of American businesses. 200 people, the biggest delegation of Americans. It was an American delegation. That delegation was at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. Some restrictions were introduced, including for American companies. Due to that, some of the American companies have lost out. They've given up the business into the hands of their competitors from other countries. We talked about that. What for? There's no practical reason, but there are losses. As for our trade with the U.S., I think it's $28 billion, roughly. It increased by 16% in the first quarter of this year. If this trend continues, I think that will be a benefit for everybody. Sure. You know what? Let's have a couple of questions from here and a couple of questions from here, all right? The lady here, please. Andrei, let the lady answer. Ask a question. Mr. President, thank you very much for affording me the opportunity to ask you a question. A few years ago, you met President Biden. That was when he was vice president. What he said was that he looked you in the eye, and he said that he didn't see a soul. And you said, that means we understand one another. Did you, tell me please, did you look him in the eye, and what did you see there? Did you see a person with whom you can work? And please tell me, President Biden, did he invite you to visit the Russian White House? And if the White House, rather, and if yes, did you agree to go to the White House? President Biden did not invite me as his guest. I didn't invite him either. I think for visits like that, for meetings like that, you need to have the proper conditions. You need to be ready. As for the soul seeing it or not seeing something, well, this isn't the first time I've heard this. Frankly speaking, I don't recall this conversation, but I will allow that it happened and it escaped my attention. But if you ask me what sort of a partner, what sort of a conversational partner Biden is, I'd say he's very constructive, he's very balanced, just the way that I expected. He's very experienced. You can tell that at first glance. But he talked about his family, recalling them. He talked about what his mom said. You know, these are important things. They're not directly related to any matters directly, but it shows the extent of his moral values, and that's all quite attractive. And what I think is, on the whole, we spoke the same language. That doesn't mean that we necessarily have to look into our eyes, look into our souls. We need to have eternal friendship and love, but no, we have to represent our countries, and the relationship is a pragmatic one, primarily. Yes, please. Andrei Kolesnikov from Kommersant, the newspaper. Mr. Putin, based on the outcome of this meeting, did you have any new, are there any new illusions? Well, I didn't have any old illusions. What about new ones? No illusions, there are no illusions, and there could not be any illusions. Okay, over here, you're raising your hand. Yeah, please. Give her the microphone. The young lady can decide herself whom to give the microphone to. Hello, I'm from the channel Zvezda. Mr. Putin, a question about global climate change. Did you speak with President Biden about that? And the second question has to do with American media. Recently, you gave a big interview to NBC. Do you think that it is fair to give the American president's do you think it's fair to give an interview to the American media when it doesn't happen the other way around? And how do you feel about having your words always being distorted? You know what, about the distortion or about silencing things? Well, that is the practice in international relations today. What can you do? Can't do anything about it. We've gotten used to that a long time ago, and we're all living with it. We've been living with it for decades. As for who's giving an interview, that decision is taken by the relevant leaders or countries. And if you want to convey something in addition to people, then, well, we try to do that. I gave an interview to the American press, and that's exactly what I was trying to do there. As for the activities of our mass media in general, for example, President Biden raised the question about freedom, about the freedom of Europe and Russia, I think, or rather Radio Free Europe, which we called a foreign agent. Biden broached that. Before that, there were other media outlets. There's also Sputnik, a media outlet working abroad. And before that, the United States called Sputnik a foreign agent. And what we did in response. What we did with regard to the Voice of America, of America. And this is done in accordance with the law, registration, etc. And a lot of problems have been created for our personnel with money transfers and that sort of thing. We don't have that kind of a problem. And for American medias, the American media hasn't complied with all of the requirements of Russian law. I think that even here we can work through the ministries of foreign affairs to resolve matters. Let's go over here, sure. Okay, I was referring to the lady there. But sure, yeah, you can go next. Thank you very much. Galina Polonska from Euronews. Galina Polonska, Euronews. We all saw you shake Joe Biden's hand at the very beginning. Here's my question. Were you able to bring mutual understanding and trust to a different level with the President of the United States? Do you think it's realistic at this juncture to have a new level of relations when it's where they're absolutely clear and transparent, and where there'll be an understanding of where both countries need to go to? Let me tell you, in life, there is no happiness, there's only the specter of happiness. I think in this situation, there's not like family-based trust, but I think that there was some specter of trust that we caught a glimpse of. Please. Please, the microphone. You already have a microphone, or you want a second one, huh? This one wasn't turned on. Thank you. The coronavirus is one of the most important issues on the planet now. Was this issue discussed with the American president? And if yes, what are the prospects for joint work with the Americans in order to curb this plague? And perhaps you've talked about mutual recognition of vaccines. We did talk about that, but we only touched on it tangentially. We answered a request by the Americans to send our equipment as humanitarian assistance. You know, America is a big, powerful country. And it's not like they don't have money. Just at that point, they really needed our equipment. We did it free of charge. And we're prepared to continue cooperation on these lines in the future, but we didn't talk about it in general. We didn't talk about it in detail, rather, today. With regard to President Trump, after those meetings, the relations between the two countries deteriorated further. Is there any indication that that won't happen again? Did we reach in our relationship with the U.S. some sort of a low point that we can push off from and go up? That's difficult to say now. That's because all of the activities that have to do with worsening the relations, all of the actions that did that were not initiated by us. I don't know. Please. Alexander Ganov, Komsomolskaya Pravda. I'm not sure if you know, but our team won. Congratulations. So what do you think is the score in the Putin-Biden meeting? And the second question. The Americans, before coming to Geneva, they kept on saying, we're going to put pressure on Putin, we're going to put pressure on Russia. Did you feel that pressure? Was there any conflict? That's probably the most important question that Russia's interested in. That's it, I think. Another thing. You know, well, I think that's pretty much enough. I think so too. We didn't experience any pressure, although there was a candid and open conversation, and there were no personal or diplomatic deviations from the topics we set out to address. So let me repeat once more. There was no pressure from either side. It would be senseless to do that, too. That's not the reason why people meet each other. What was the first part of your question? Oh, the score. Well, I think before our meeting, President Biden said that it wasn't a sporting event, and I fully agree with that. What's the point of keeping score? The meeting had results. It was substantive, it was concrete. And it took place in an atmosphere that was geared toward achieving results. First and foremost, the specter of trust that our colleague from Yavor News talked about. Please, BBC News, go ahead. Thank you.
Rosenberg, BBC News. Vladimir Vladimirovich, Joe Biden призывает за стабильные предсказуемые отношения с Россией.
Stable, predictable relations with Russia. But on the West, it's believed that the unpredictability is a feature of Russian foreign policy. Are you prepared to renounce unpredictability for the sake of improving relations with the West? Thank you. I envy you for the level of artistry you've achieved here. So, turning to the first, as for the first question, do you think, and then the second question, are you, the first question, the West considers, and secondly, are you prepared to renounce it? Just because the West believes that to be the case, it doesn't mean that it is the case. Let's turn to the first part of the question. You said that the West believes that Russia's foreign policy is unpredictable. Let me answer that. When the U.S. exited the ABM treaty for no reason, why did they do that? That had an effect on strategic stability, and now the withdrawal from the INF in 2012. What's stable about that? There's nothing stable about that at all. Withdrawal from the Open Skies Treaty. What's stable there? There's practically nothing left. But luckily, Joe Biden is addressing the area of strategic stability. He has made quite a sound decision to extend the START treaty. Well, let's take the situation surrounding Ukraine and Crimea. Everybody's dancing around that, right? What is stable about the fact that a state coup d'etat was organized in Ukraine when President Yanukovych agreed with all of the demands of the opposition? He was prepared, in essence, to leave power and to hold new elections? No. No. There was a need to carry out a bloody coup d'etat, which led to results that are well known, and well known in East Ukraine. And you think that we're unpredictable? No, I don't think so. In my view, we are acting absolutely appropriately to counter threats that are emerging against us. And I think for the situation to be truly stable, we need to reach an agreement on a proper code of proper rules of conduct in all the areas that we talked about: strategic stability, cybersecurity, tackling issues that have to do with regional conflicts. I think that we can reach an agreement on everything. At least today, the impression arose. That impression arose based on the outcome of our meeting, my meeting with Mr. Biden. What? Are we going to start singing songs now? Blue fog, deceit. Well, now our foreign colleagues aren't going to understand that reference. Okay, let's give the floor to one of the foreign outlets, Bloomberg, please. I have a follow-up question.
Bloomberg News или архивов? Владимир Владимирович.
Bloomberg News. Mr. Putin, in 2016 you met with Trump. After that, American sanctions were adopted. Well, the latest round were adopted very quickly. Did you talk with Joe Biden about the guarantees that you would have for these sanctions to be lifted, or rather for new sanctions not to be introduced against Russia? And you said that there's some incipient hope. With regard to Biden, you mentioned some initial agreements. Do you have more trust that he'll be able to do it? Because it's believed that the American administration has more solidarity with the American president than was the case during Donald Trump's term. You talked about cybersecurity. You had consultations on Ukraine. I wasn't sure, was there a working group on cybersecurity? And you talked about some red lines. Did you lay out the red lines specifically about that? Can you tell us about that? Well, let's turn to the red lines. I've already addressed that many times. The understanding arises during negotiations on key areas of our interaction. It makes no sense to try to scare one another. When people sit down at the negotiating table in order to establish relations, not to intimidate each other. As for these sanctions, as for restrictions on economies, I've already said, we don't know what the domestic policy mood is like over there. We know the general situation, but we can't say what's happening in detail. So there's some who are against Russian development. There's some who are proponents of it. It's difficult to say which side is prevailing. But if after our meeting some steps are taken, the ones that you recalled in 2016, then what will that mean? That will mean that we've lost the latest opportunity. Please. One final question from a journalist from Canada.
You said to a couple of my colleagues you wanted unbiased. Do you have a translation?
No.
Do you hear me now?
No.
По-русски?
Не хотят Канаду включить.
Yeah, they didn't want
Хорошо?
No. Нет перевода.
There's no interpretation. I can't hear it.
I will try and repeat.
Сейчас, может, на другой канал перейдут. Попробуйте.
Maybe you will try on a different channel.
Да? Нет. Я не слышу ничего.
Nope,
Вообще ничего
I
нет.
can't hear anything. I don't hear anything whatsoever.
Сейчас. Секундочку.
1 second.
Извините, пожалуйста.
Хорошо?
Есть звук. Повторите, пожалуйста, сначала.
Thank you.
Sorry, please, if you wouldn't mind repeating.
Tamara Altaresco from Radio Canada in Moscow. You said to a couple of my colleagues you wanted unbiased, fair questions and coverage. I have a fair question for you. It actually comes from my 9-year-old daughter, who asked me before I left to come here, what is the big deal with this summit? And it's quite a complicated answer for a 9-year-old. So I'd like you to explain to us, in your own words, Mr. President, why is this relationship so complicated? And also, she'd like to know, and I'd like to know, why are young people not allowed to protest in Russia?
Yes, that's great. It's great that your 9-year-old daughter is interested in these questions. The answer is very simple. You need to look around yourself. You need to see how beautiful the world is. And adults, the leaders of 2 countries, the biggest nuclear powers, are meeting. They're doing that in order to make the world safer, more reliable, and a place for everyone, a home for everyone to flourish, for all those who live on our planet. And they're doing that, they're addressing issues that have to do with a terrible weapon, which needs to be limited. They need to draw up common rules on refraining from using those weapons. They talked about protecting the environment, about rivers being clean, about seas being clean, about there not being any floods, not being any droughts, about providing food to everyone on the planet, no matter where they are. They'll talk about issues of healthcare, so that when children grow up, they get sick less often, they have the opportunity to study, and they have the opportunity to look at the future confidently. And I hope that at our meeting, I hope that you will cover our meeting based on those considerations in particular. I thank you for your attention. All the best.
Some fresh air. Yes.
Уважаемые коллеги, к нам идут. Не будут через эту дверь.
Please.
Monsieur le Président, merci encore, bienvenue au Congrès. Merci pour ces possibilités d'avoir quelques entretiens. J'espère que vous avez eu des
Mr. President, thank you for... Okay.
Je souhaite m'entretenir avec vous de quelques sujets communs à nos deux pays.
Господин президент, прежде всего хотел вас поблагодарить за то, что вы предоставили такую замечательную площадку здесь, в Женеве, для проведения российско-американской.
Monsieur le Président, avant tout, permettez-moi de vous remercier encore une fois de nous avoir accordé une plateforme excellente pour notre rencontre avec mon homologue américain.
Женева всегда гостеприимна.
Genève a toujours été montrée son hospitalité.
Помню свой приезд ровно назад на мероприятие.
Test 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3. 1, 1, 2, 2. Hey, hey, hey. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
Careful, this is up right now.
Copy, take it.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a different translation or something. Yeah, that was someone tweeted. I don't know.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program will begin in 2 minutes.
Elise, Sally, it dropped, probably because the president.
Be super careful moving. Everything is like shaking a lot. Like it's shaking the man cam, it's shaking my cam.
Yeah, Lester, we are here waiting for the president to arrive just moments from now. Members of his team who are behind closed doors are about to have already taken their seats, among them the Secretary of State Tony Blinken and his national security advisor. As you noted, Vladimir Putin said that today's meeting was constructive, that there was no hostility. He said that there was no pressure put on either side. Remember, the president himself said he would be confronting Vladimir Putin on a variety of topics, so it would be on him now to try to set the record straight about what happened behind closed doors. What was striking comments earlier from Putin is that he took no responsibility for Russia's aggressive behavior. His remarks were filled with that form of whataboutism, blaming the U.S. for so many of his own aggressive acts, as he suggested. Their meeting lasting roughly 3+ hours, the White House saying it would go 4 to 5 hours with their expectation. So either it was efficient or there was nothing left to say. Lester?
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Been a long day for y'all. I know it was easy getting into the pre-meeting. There was no problem getting through those doors, was it? Was there? Anyway, hello everyone. Well, I've just finished the last meeting of this week's long trip, the U.S.-Russian summit. And I know there were a lot of hype around this meeting, but it's pretty straightforward to me, the meeting. One, there's no substitute, as those of you who have covered me for a while know, for face-to-face dialogue between leaders. None. And President Putin and I had share a unique responsibility to manage the relationship between two powerful and proud countries. A relationship that has to be stable and predictable. And we should be able to cooperate where it's in our mutual interest. And where we have differences, I want President Putin to understand why I say what I say and why I do what I do, and how we'll respond to specific kinds of actions that harm America's interest. Now, I told President Putin my agenda is not against Russia or anyone else. It's for the American people. Fighting COVID-19, rebuilding our economy, reestablishing relationships around the world with our allies and friends, and protecting the American people. That's my responsibility as president. I also told him that no president of the United States could keep faith with the American people if they did not speak out to defend our democratic values, to stand up for the universal and fundamental freedoms that all men and women have, in our view. That's just part of the DNA of our country. So human rights is going to always be on the table, I told him. It's not about just going after Russia when they violate human rights. It's about who we are. How could I be the President of the United States of America and not speak out against the violation of human rights? I told him that unlike other countries, including Russia, we're uniquely a product of an idea. You've heard me say this before again and again, but I'm going to keep saying it. What's that idea? We don't derive our rights from the government. We possess them because we're born, period. And we yield them to a government. And so the forum, I pointed out to him that that's why we're going to raise our concerns about cases like Alexei Navalny. I made it clear to President Putin that we'll continue to raise issues of fundamental human rights, because that's what we are. That's who we are. The idea is we hold these truths self-evident, that all men and women, we haven't lived up to it completely, but we've always widened the arc of commitment and included more and more people. And I raised the case of two wrongfully imprisoned American citizens, Paul Whelan and Trevor Reed. I also raised the ability of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty to operate and the importance of a free press and freedom of speech. I made it clear that we will not tolerate attempts to violate our democratic sovereignty or destabilize our democratic elections, and we would respond. The bottom line is, I told President Putin that we need to have some basic rules of the road that we can all abide by. I also said there are areas where there's a mutual interest for us to cooperate. For our people, Russian and American people, but also for the benefit of the world and the security of the world. One of those areas is strategic stability. You asked me many times, what was I going to discuss with Putin before I came? I told you I only negotiate with the individual, and now I can tell you what I was intending to do all along. And that is to discuss and raise the issue of strategic stability and try to set up a mechanism whereby we dealt with it. We discussed in detail the next steps our country should take on arms control measures, the steps we need to take to reduce the risk of unintended conflict. And I'm pleased that you agreed today to launch a bilateral strategic stability dialogue. Diplomatic speak for saying get our military experts and our diplomats together to work on a mechanism that can lead to control of new and dangerous and sophisticated weapons that are coming on the scene now, that reduce the times of response, that raise the prospects of accidental war. And we went into some detail of what those weapon systems were. Another area we spent a great deal of time on was cyber and cybersecurity. I talked about the proposition that certain critical infrastructure should be off limits to attack, period, by cyber or any other means. I gave them a list. If I'm not mistaken, I don't have it in front of me, 16 specific entities, 16 defined as critical infrastructure under U.S. policy, from the energy sector to our water systems. Of course, the principle is one thing. It has to be backed up by practice. Responsible countries need to take action against criminals who conduct ransomware activities on their territory. So we agreed to task experts in both our countries to work on specific understandings about what's off limits and to follow up on specific cases that originate in other countries, in either of our countries. There's a long list of other things we spent time on, from the urgent need to preserve and reopen the humanitarian corridors in Syria so that we can get food, just simple food and basic necessities, to people who are starving to death. How to build it and how it is in the interest of both Russia and the United States to ensure that Iran does not acquire nuclear weapons. We agreed to work together there because as much as Russia's interest is ours. And to how we can ensure the Arctic remains a region of cooperation rather than conflict. I caught part of President Putin's press conference, and he talked about the need for us to be able to have some kind of modus operandi where we dealt with making sure the Arctic was, in fact, a free zone. And to how we can each contribute to the shared effort of preventing the resurgence of terrorism in Afghanistan. It's very much in the interest of Russia not to have a resurgence of terrorism in Afghanistan. There are also areas that are more challenging. I communicated the United States' unwavering commitment to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We agreed to pursue diplomacy related to the Minsk agreement. And I shared our concern about Belarus. He didn't disagree with what happened. He just has a different perspective of what to do about it. But I know you have a lot of questions, so let me close with this. It was important to meet in person, so there can be no mistake about or misrepresentations about what I wanted to communicate. I did what I came to do. Number one, identify areas of practical work our two countries can do to advance our mutual interest and also benefit the world. Two, communicate directly that the United States will respond to actions that impair our vital interest or those of our allies. And three, to clearly lay out our country's priorities and our values so we heard it straight from me. And I must tell you, the tone of the entire meetings, I guess it was a total of 4 hours, was good, positive. There wasn't any strident action taken. Where we disagreed, I disagreed, stated where it was. Where he disagreed, he stated. But it was not done in a hyperbolic atmosphere. That is too much of what's been going on. Over this last week, I believe, I hope, the United States has shown the world that we are back, standing with our allies. We rallied our fellow democracies to make concerted commitments to take on the biggest challenges our world faces. And now we've established a clear basis on how we intend to deal with Russia and the U.S.-Russian relationship. There's much more work ahead. I'm not suggesting that any of this is done. We've gotten a lot of business done on this trip. And before I take your questions, I want to say one last thing. Folks, look, this is about how we move from here. I listened to, again, a significant portion of what President Putin's press conference was. And as he pointed out, this is about practical, straightforward, no-nonsense decisions that we have to make or not make. We'll find out within the next 6 months to a year whether or not we actually have a strategic dialogue that matters. We'll find out whether we work to deal with everything from release of people in Russian prisons or not. We'll find out whether we have a cybersecurity arrangement that begins to bring some order. Because look, the countries that most are likely to be damaged, failure to do that, are the major countries. For example, when I talked about the pipeline that cyber hit for $5 million, that ransomware hit in the United States, I looked at him and I said, well, how would you feel if ransomware took on the pipelines from your oil fields? He said it would matter. This is not about just our self-interest. It's about a mutual self-interest. I'll take your questions, and as usual, folks, they gave me a list of the people I'm going to call on. So, Jonathan, Associated Press.
Thank you, sir. U.S. intelligence has said that Russia tried to interfere in the last 2 presidential elections and that Russia groups are behind hacks like SolarWinds and some of the ransomware attacks you just mentioned. Putin, in his news conference just now, accepted no responsibility for any misbehavior. Your predecessor opted not to demand that Putin stop these disruptions. So what is something that concrete, sir, that you achieved today to prevent that from happening again, and what were the consequences you threatened him?
Whether I stopped it from happening again, he knows I will take action, like we did when this last time out. What happened was we, in fact, made it clear that we were not going to continue to allow this to go on. The end result was we ended up withdrawing, they ended up withdrawing ambassadors. We closed down some of their facilities in the United States, etc. He knows there are consequences. Now, look, one of the consequences that I don't know, I shouldn't say this, it's unfair of me. I suspect you may all think doesn't matter. But I'm confident matters to him, and to other world leaders of big nations. His credibility worldwide shrinks. Let's get this straight. How would it be if the United States were viewed by the rest of the world as interfering with the elections directly of other countries, and everybody knew it? What would it be like if we engaged in activities that he is engaged in? It diminishes the standing of a country that is desperately trying to make sure it maintains its standing as a major world power. And so it's not just what I do, it's what the actions that other countries take, in this case Russia, that are contrary to international norms. It's the price they pay. They are not able to dictate what happens in the world. There are other nations of significant consequence, i.e. the United States of America being one of them.
Mr. President, just a quick follow on the same theme of consequences. You said just now that you spoke to him a lot about human rights. What did you say would happen if opposition leader Alexei Navalny dies?
I made it clear to him that I believe the consequences of that would be devastating for Russia. I'll go back to the same point. What do you think happens when he's saying it's not about hurting Navalny, all the stuff he says to rationalize the treatment of Navalny, and then he dies in prison? I pointed out to him that it matters a great deal when a country, in fact, and they asked me why I thought it was important to continue to have problems with the president of Syria. I said because he's a violation of international norm. It's called the Chemical Weapons Treaty. It can't be trusted. It's about trust. It's about their ability to influence other nations in a positive way. Look, would you like to trade our economy for Russia's economy? Would you like to trade? And by the way, we talked about trade. I don't have any problem with doing business with Russia as long as they do it based on international norms. It's in our interest to see the Russian people do well economically. I don't have a problem with that. But if they do not act according to international norms, then guess what? That won't happen with us. It will not happen with other nations. And he kind of talked about that, didn't he, today? About how the need to reach out to other countries to invest in Russia. They won't, as long as they are convinced that, in fact, the violations, for example, the American businessman who was in house arrest, and I pointed out, you want to get American business to invest, let him go. Change the dynamic. Because American businessmen we're ready to show up. They don't want to hang around in Moscow. I mean, look, guys, I know we make foreign policy out to be this great, great skill that somehow is sort of like a secret code. All foreign policies is a logical extension of personal relationships. It's the way human nature functions. And understand, when you run a country that does not abide by international norms, and yet you need those international norms to be somehow managed so that you can participate in the benefits that flow from them, it hurts you. That's not a satisfying answer. Biden said he'd invade Russia. You know, it's not, you know. By the way, that was a joke. That's not true. But my generic point is, it is more complicated than that. David Sanger. I thought I just saw David. There he is.
Thank you, Mr. President. In the run-up to this discussion, there's been a lot of talk about the two countries spilling down into a Cold War. And I'm wondering if there was anything that you emerged from in the discussion that made you think that he...
With your permission, I'm going to take my coat off. The sun is hot.
Anything that would make you think that Mr. Putin has decided to move away from his fundamental role as a disruptor, particularly a disruptor of NATO and the United States. And if I could also just follow up on your description of how you gave him a list of critical infrastructure in the United States, did you lay out very clearly what it was that the penalty would be for interfering in that critical infrastructure? Did you leave that vague? Did he respond in any way to it?
Let me answer your first. Well, I'll answer your second question first. I pointed out to him we have significant cyber capability, and he knows it. He doesn't know exactly what it is, but it's significant. And if in fact they violate these basic norms, we will respond. Cyber. He knows, in the cyber way. Number two, I think that the last thing he wants now is a Cold War. Without quoting him, which I don't think is appropriate, let me ask you a rhetorical question. You got a multi-thousand-mile border with China. China's moving ahead, hell-bent on election, as they say, seeking to be the most powerful economy in the world, the largest, and the most powerful military in the world. You're in a situation where your economy is struggling. You need to move it in a more aggressive way than in terms of growing it. And I don't think he's looking for a Cold War with the United States. I don't think it's about as I said to him, I said, your generation and mine are about 10 years apart. This is not a kumbaya moment, as he used to say back in the 60s in the United States, like, let's hug and love each other. But it's clearly not in anybody's interest, your country's or mine, for us to be in a situation where we're in a new Cold War. And I truly believe he thinks that. He understands that. But that does not mean he's ready to, quote, figuratively speaking, lay down his arms and say, come on. He still, I believe, is concerned about being, quote, encircled. He still is concerned that we, in fact, are looking to take him down, etc. He still has those concerns. But I don't think they are the driving force as the kind of relationship he's looking for with the United States. Jennifer Jacobs.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. President. Is there a particular reason why the summit lasted only about 3 hours? We know you had maybe allotted 4 to 5 hours. Was there any reason it ran shorter? Also, President Putin said that there were no threats or scare tactics issued. Do you agree with that assessment, that there were no threats or scare tactics?
Yes.
And also, did you touch on Afghanistan and the safe withdrawal of troops?
Yes, 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 and yes. Let me go back to the first part. The reason it didn't go longer is when the last time two heads of state have spent over 2 hours in direct conversation across the table, going into excruciating detail. You may know of time, I don't. I can't think of one. So we didn't need, as we got through when we brought in the larger group, our defense, our intelligence, and our foreign, well, my foreign minister was my Secretary of State was with me the whole time. our ambassador, etc. We brought everybody in. We had covered so much. And so there was a summary done by him and by me of what we covered. Lavrov and Blinken talked about what we had covered. We raised things that required more amplification or made sure we didn't have any misunderstandings. And so it was kind of after 2 hours there, we looked at each other like, okay, what next? What is going to happen next is we're going to be able to look back, look ahead in 3 to 6 months and say, did the things we agreed to sit down and try to work out, did it work? Are we closer to a major strategic stability talks and progress? Are we further along in terms of and go down the line? That's going to be the test. I'm not sitting here saying because the President and I agreed that we would do these things that all of a sudden it's going to work. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is I think there's a genuine prospect to significantly improve the relations between our two countries without us giving up a single solitary thing based on principle and our values. No, there were no threats. There were, as a matter of fact, I heard he quoted my mom and quoted other people today. It was very, as we say, which will shock you coming from me, somewhat colloquial. And we talked about basic fundamental things. And you know how I am. I explain things based on personal basis. What happens if, for example? And so there were no threats, just simple assertions made, and no, well, if you do that, then we'll do this, with anything I said. It was just letting him know where I stood, what I thought we could accomplish together, and what, in fact, if there were violations of American sovereignty, what we would do. No, he asked us about Afghanistan. He said that he hopes that we're able to maintain some peace and security, and I said that has a lot to do with you. He indicated that he was prepared to, quote, help on Afghanistan. I won't go into detail now, and help on Iran, and help on, and in return, we told him a lot what we wanted to do relative to bringing some stability and economic security or physical security to the people of Syria and Libya. So we had those discussions. Yamish.
Thanks so much, Mr. President. You say that you didn't issue any threats? Were there any ultimatums made when it comes to ransomware? And how will you measure success, especially when it comes to these working groups on Russian meddling and on cybersecurity?
Well, it's going to be real easy. They either, for example, on cybersecurity, are we going to work out where they take action against the ransomware criminals on Russian territory? They didn't do it. I don't think they planned it in this case. And are they going to act? We'll find out. Will we commit? What can we commit to act in terms of anything affecting, violating international norms that negatively affects Russia? What are we going to agree to do? And so I think we have real opportunities to move. And I think that one of the things that I noticed when we had the larger meeting is that people who are very, very well informed started thinking, you know, this could be a real problem. What happens if that ransomware outfit were sitting in Florida or Maine and took action, as I said, on their single lifeline to their economy, oil? It'd be devastating. And they're like, you could see them kind of go, oh, we'd do that, but like, whoa. So it's in everybody's interest that these things be acted on. We'll see, though, what happens from these groups we put together. The third one, yes, go ahead.
Mr. President, when President Putin was questioned today about human rights, he said the reason why he's cracking down on opposition leaders is because he doesn't want something like January 6th to happen in Russia. And he also said that he doesn't want to see groups formed like Black Lives Matter. What's your response to that, please?
My response is kind of what I communicated, that I think that's a ridiculous comparison. It's one thing for literally criminals to break through cordon, go into the Capitol, kill a police officer, and be held unaccountable. and it is for people objecting and marching on the Capitol and saying, you are not allowing me to speak freely. You are not allowing me to do A, B, C, or D. And so they're very different criteria. Steve Holland, Reuters.
President Putin said he was satisfied with the answer about your comment about him being a killer. Could you give us your side on this? What did you tell him?
He's satisfied. Why would I bring it up again?
And now that you've talked to him, do you believe you can trust him?
Look, this is not about trust. This is about self-interest and verification of self-interest. That's what it's about. So I virtually almost anyone that I would work out an agreement with that affected the American people's interest, I don't say, well, I trust you, no problem. Let's see what happens. You know, as that old expression goes, the proof of the pudding's in the eating. We're going to know shortly. Igor, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty.
Hello, Mr. President. Hello, Mr. President.
You want to go in the shade? You can't. Can you see?
Thank you. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So I think you know attacks in civil society and the free press continue inside Russia.
Yes.
For example, Radio Free Europe.
Yes.
Radio Liberty, Voice of America, Current Time TV channel where I work, branded foreign agents, and several other independent media. So we are essentially being forced out in Russia 30 years after President Yeltsin invited us in. My question is, after your talks with President Putin, how interested do you think he's in improving the media climate in Russia?
I wouldn't put it that way, in terms of improving the climate. I would, in fact, put it in terms of how much interest does he have in burnishing Russia's reputation that is viewed as not being contrary to democratic principles and free speech? That's a judgment I cannot make. I don't know. But it's not because I think he's interested in changing the nature of a closed society or closed government's actions relative to what he thinks is the right of government to do what it does. It's a very different approach. You know, there's a couple really good biographies. I told him I read most everything he's written and the speeches he's made, and I've read a couple very good biographies, which many of you have as well. And I think, and I pointed out to him that Russia had an opportunity, that brief shining moment after Gorbachev and after things began to change drastically, to actually generate a democratic government. But what happened was it failed, and there was a great race among Russian intellectuals to determine what form of government would they choose and how would they choose it. And based on what I believe Mr. Putin decided was that Russia has always been a major international power when it's been totally united as a Russian state, not based on ideology, whether it was going back to Tsar and Commissars straight through to the revolution, the Russian Revolution, and to where they are today. And I think that it's clear to me, and I've said it, that I think he decided that the way for Russia to be able to sustain itself as a great, quote, great power is to, in fact, unite the Russian people on just the strength of the government. The government controls, not necessarily ideologically, but the government. And I think that's the choice that was made. I think I'm not going to second guess whether it could have been fundamentally different, but I do think it does not lend itself to Russia maintaining itself as one of the great powers in the world.
Thank you, sir.
Did military response ever come up in this conversation today? Did you, in terms of the red lines that you laid down, is military response an option for a ransomware attack? And President Putin had called you in his press conference an experienced person. You famously told him he didn't have a soul. Do you now have a deeper understanding of him after this meeting?
Thank you very much.
But on the military response, sir?
No, we didn't talk about military response.
In the spirit, Mr. President, of you saying that there is no substitute for face-to-face dialogue, and also with what you said at NATO, that the biggest problems right now are Russia and China. You've spoken many times about how you have spent perhaps more time with President Xi than any other world leader. So is there going to become a time where you might call him, old friend to old friend, and ask him to open up China to the World Health Organization investigators who are trying to get to the bottom of COVID-19?
Let's get something straight. We know each other well. We're not old friends. It's just pure business.
So I guess my question would be, you've said that you were going to press China. You signed on to the G7 communique that said the G7 were calling on China to open up, to let the investigators in. But China basically says they don't want to be interfered with anymore. So what happens now?
The impact, the world's attitude toward China as it develops. China's trying very hard to project itself as a responsible and very, very forthcoming nation. That they are trying very hard to talk about how they're taking and helping the world in terms of COVID-19 and vaccines, and they're trying very hard. Look, certain things you don't have to explain to the people of the world. They see the results. Is China really actually trying to get to the bottom of this? One thing they did discuss, as I told you, in the EU and at the G7 and with NATO. What we should be doing, and what I'm going to make an effort to do, is rally the world to work on what is going to be the physical mechanism available to detect early on the next pandemic and have a mechanism by which we can respond to it and respond to it early. It's going to happen. It's going to happen, and we need to do that. Thank you.
What did Putin say about Paul Whelan and Trevor What if you're not one of the 16? What did he say about Paul Whelan and Trevor
I'd say again, we can't hear you. I said the families of the detained Americans came up and we discussed it. We're going to follow through with that discussion. I am not going to walk away on that.
Why are you so confident he'll change his behavior, Mr. President?
Yeah, I'm not confident in changing behavior. What the hell? What do you do all the time? So when did I say I was confident?
You said in the next 6 months you'll be able to determine.
What I said was, let's get it straight. I said what will change their behavior is that the rest of the world reacts to them and it diminishes their standing in the world. I'm not confident of anything. I'm just stating the fact.
But given his past behavior has not changed, and in that press conference after sitting down with you for several hours, he denied any involvement in cyber attacks. He downplayed human rights abuses. He even refused to say Alexei Navalny's name. So how does that account to a constructive meeting as President Putin framed?
If you don't understand that, you're in the wrong business.
Is the summit with China next?